When Tyler moved into my dorm, I thought I'd finally lucked out. He was everything a roommate should be. Quiet, polite, and generally kept to himself. Compared to last semester's nightmare of a roommate, who blasted music at all hours and left trash everywhere, Tyler felt like a blessing. The first few weeks we barely talked, but that suited me fine. I was swamped with my biology classes, and having a drama-free environment was exactly what I needed. Then little things started to go missing. My phone charger disappeared one day, only to turn up in Tyler's backpack a week later. My textbooks would vanish from my desk and reappear on his shelf. It was weird, but every time I asked about it, he'd just smile and say, "No idea how it got there." His expression was always calm, almost too calm, like I was the one being unreasonable. At first, I brushed it off, chalking it up to some weird, absent-minded quirk of his. Maybe he just grabbed stuff without thinking. But the more it happened, the more it started to bother me. Something wasn't right, but I convinced myself it was harmless. After all, Tyler seemed normal. It was around 2 a.m. when I realized I'd left my headphones on Tyler's side of the room. He'd already gone to bed, or at least I thought he had. I didn't want to disturb him, so I moved quietly, stepping lightly across the cold floor. But as I neared his side, I noticed something strange. The light from my desk lamp barely reached him, casting eerie shadows on the wall, but I could see that Tyler wasn't in bed. He was sitting on the floor, facing the wall, his back unnaturally straight. My heart started pounding as I took in the scene. The wall in front of him was covered in strange symbols, dark smears that looked disturbingly like dried blood. Tyler's eyes were wide and vacant, staring straight ahead, his lips moving in a slow, rhythmic whisper. The words, if they were even words, were unlike anything I'd ever heard. It sounded more like a low, guttural chant, something ancient and wrong. And then I saw it, one of my own photographs held delicately in his hands. I don't even know where he'd gotten it. He lifted the picture with a sort of reverence and lowered it slowly into a small glass jar filled with thick, dark liquid. The jar was oily, almost pulsing, as if the substance inside was alive. My mouth went dry. I felt rooted to the spot, afraid to even breathe. Somehow, I managed to back away, moving silently to my side of the room, slipping into bed without making a sound. I stayed there, my eyes squeezed shut, pretending I hadn't seen a thing. The next morning, I confronted him, my voice trembling. "Tyler, what were you doing last night?" He looked genuinely confused, then let out a low laugh. "What are you talking about, man? You must have been dreaming." But there was a flicker in his eyes, something dark and amused. After that night, something shifted between us. Tyler acted as if nothing had happened, his behavior just as calm and polite as ever. But I couldn't shake what I'd seen. The symbols, the chanting, the jar. Every time I looked at him, I wondered who or what I was really living with. I tried to keep my distance, burying myself in coursework, pretending everything was normal. But my anxiety only grew worse. More of my things kept disappearing. Pens, notebooks, even random items like my comb or spare socks. And somehow, they always ended up on Tyler's side of the room, tucked away in drawers or on shelves. The worst part was, every time I found something out of place, Tyler would just give me that same unsettling smile and say, "You're losing things a lot lately. Maybe you should be more careful." One evening, as I was tidying up, I noticed a small, neatly wrapped box under my bed. I hadn't put it there. My stomach twisted as I pulled it out, my hands trembling slightly. The wrapping paper was plain but meticulously folded. tied with a crimson ribbon. I knew, even before opening it, that it was from him. I peeled back the paper, heart hammering. Inside was a single, glossy lock of my own hair, bound tightly with a red thread. Next to it was a small slip of paper, the handwriting neat and precise. "You've seen too much." I dropped the box like it had burned me, stumbling back. My pulse thundered in my ears as I scanned the room, half expecting Tyler to be watching me from some dark corner, but he was nowhere in sight. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those vacant eyes were always on me, even when I was alone. I started double-locking the door and sleeping with the light on, but it didn't matter. The fear was always there, growing with every passing day. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. I went straight to the campus registrar, my nerves shot. All I wanted was something, anything, to prove that Tyler was real, that I wasn't losing my mind. But when I asked about him, the woman behind the desk just frowned. "Tyler?" she repeated slowly, checking the records. "There's no one by that name assigned to your dorm. Your room's supposed to be a single." The words sent a chill through my entire body. No, there has to be a mistake. He's been living with me for months." She shook her head, looking concerned. "You've been living alone all semester." I stumbled out of there, barely able to breathe, and raced back to my dorm. I needed to get out now, but when I burst into the room, every trace of Tyler was gone. His clothes, his books, the weird jars, all of it. The place looked like it had been empty for years, except for one thing. Sitting on my bed was a single jar filled with that same thick, oily liquid. And inside, floating in the darkness, was a photograph of me, staring back at the camera. My face was blank, my eyes hollow. As I reached for it, a soft whisper echoed from the jar. "We're not done yet." The jar slipped from my fingers and shattered on the floor, the liquid seeping into the carpet as the whisper seemed to echo, growing louder in my head. I'd been sitting at my desk for hours, the soft glow of my laptop screen the only light in our cramped dorm. It was around 2 a.m., and I was alone again. Ricky, my roommate, was hardly ever here, always off somewhere else. Editing was usually a peaceful, if tedious, ritual for me. But tonight, as I sifted through clips for my documentary project, something caught my eye. In one shot, just behind me, a shadow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe just my own reflection blurred in the dim room. But no, when I rewound the footage, the shadow stayed. It was there, and it looked like a figure, almost human in shape, hovering silently in the corner of the frame. I must have played it a dozen times, searching for any logical explanation, but the shadow remained, dark and unmoving. I shook my head, telling myself I was just tired, that it was probably nothing. But even as I continued editing, I couldn't shake that feeling, the sensation of not being alone. I glanced back, half expecting to see something lurking in the dark corners of the room. Only emptiness stared back. The next night, I tried to push the weirdness from my mind. I convinced myself it was just a fluke, a glitch in the footage or a shadow cast by some stray light I didn't notice. I had more editing to do, deadlines closing in, and I couldn't afford to get distracted. But even as I sat down to work, I felt tense. The room seemed different, quieter somehow, as if holding its breath. That uneasy sensation returned, the creeping awareness that someone was watching me. I ignored it at first, keeping my eyes glued to the screen. Then, just as I leaned back to stretch, I saw it, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. a dark blur shifting near the closet door. I froze, heart hammering, and turned quickly. But nothing was there. Only the dull metal door, shut tight. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Was it my imagination? I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease, but I couldn't let it go. What if it wasn't a trick of the light? What if I hadn't been alone last night? Swallowing my apprehension, I grabbed my camera and tripod. If something or someone was lurking around, I wanted proof. I set up the camera at the corner of my desk, making sure it had a clear view of the entire room, including the closet. I felt ridiculous doing this, but I had to know. When I finally crawled into bed, the room felt suffocatingly still. My ears strained against the silence, searching for any sign of movement, any creak or rustle in the dark. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under, and I drifted into a restless sleep, the camera's tiny red light blinking softly in the dark like a warning. The next morning, I felt groggy, like I hadn't slept at all. The camera sat there silently, still recording as I turned it off with shaky fingers. My stomach knotted with a sense of dread I couldn't quite explain as I sat down to review the footage. I sped through the hours quickly, nothing at first but my own restless tossing and turning. But then, at exactly 3 a.m., the closet door moved. I leaned closer, my pulse racing. The door creaked open slowly, the motion so deliberate it made my skin crawl. Then something stepped out. A thin, gaunt figure draped in oversized clothes that looked disturbingly familiar. My breath caught. It was wearing Ricky's hoodie, the same one he'd left hanging in the closet last week. The figure paused, half in shadow, then turned its head toward my sleeping form. I watched, horrified, as it crept across the room and stopped just inches from where I lay. It stood there for what felt like forever, staring down at me with an unnatural stillness. My heart hammered painfully as I realized just how close it had been. Close enough to reach out and touch me. Then it sat down. It perched on the very edge of my bed, so lightly I hadn't even stirred. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch, just sat there, staring, watching me sleep for what felt like hours. I scrubbed through the footage, trembling. Finally, just before dawn, it rose, crossed the room silently, and slipped back into the closet, closing the door softly behind it. I felt like I might throw up. This wasn't a prank. Ricky hadn't been in the room for days. There was no way this could have been him. But then, who or what had been watching me? Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was hiding behind that closet door. Heart pounding, I called campus security, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what I'd seen. 2 officers arrived within minutes, eyes narrowing as I showed them the footage. They didn't say much, just nodded grimly and headed straight for the closet. I stayed back, feeling a sickening mix of fear and curiosity as they swung the door open and started tapping along the walls. Then one of them stopped, pressing against the back panel. It gave way. Behind the closet, there was a narrow, hidden crawl space, just big enough for someone to slip through. My stomach churned as they shone a flashlight inside. Makeshift bedding lay crumpled on the dusty floor. Empty food wrappers and dirty water bottles littered the corners. The officers exchanged a look, and one of them turned to me, face pale. Someone's been living here. It was like a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. They pulled a man out a few hours later, a disheveled, hollow-eyed stranger who looked barely human. He had been sneaking in and out of my room for weeks, slipping into the space whenever Ricky was gone. I felt numb as they led him away, mumbling something incoherent. Ricky and I were moved to another room, But even now, I can't shake it. The feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking my every move, as if some part of that stranger's gaze never really left.
It was around 2 a.m. again. The only sounds in Baldwin Hall were the low hum of the heater and the soft rustling of pages as I crammed for my chemistry exam. I was exhausted, running on caffeine and adrenaline, but I was determined to push through. That's when I heard it. 3 quick knocks on my door. Tap, tap, tap. I froze, staring at the doorknob, waiting for the usual follow-up. A voice calling out, or maybe someone laughing from down the hall. But there was nothing. It wasn't the first time. The knocking had started about a week ago, always just past 2 a.m. like clockwork. I'd thought it was one of my neighbors messing around. Maybe Drew from across the hall. But whenever I opened the door, no one was there. Just an empty hallway lit by those flickering fluorescent lights. The knocks were too light to be anything serious. Yet every night they sent a chill down my spine. And as the nights went on, they seemed different. Like whoever or whatever was behind them was waiting for me to respond. The strange thing. The knocks never happened if my roommate was here. Only when I was alone. It was the 7th night. I remember because I glanced at the clock just as it happened. 2:03 a.m. I had almost started to expect it. Those 3 sharp knocks on my door that seemed more insistent every night. But this time it was different. One long, heavy knock. Like something solid slamming against the wood. Boom. I jolted, heart racing, my eyes locked on the door. The sound reverberated through the stillness of the room. And for a second, I was too afraid to breathe. I wanted to ignore it. I really did. Maybe I was just imagining things, or maybe it was a stupid prank, but something about that single knock felt wrong. It was too loud, too deliberate, like it wanted me to know that it wasn't just some random student playing games. I didn't move. I didn't even turn my head. Instead, I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to convince myself that if I stayed still, it would go away. But then I heard it again. Only this time, the knock didn't come from the door. Came from behind me. Slowly, I turned, staring at the closet on the other side of the room. The noise came again, a soft, deliberate thud, vibrating through the wooden frame. The knock echoed in the small space, almost in rhythm with my own heartbeat. I sat there, paralyzed, trying to convince myself I was wrong. It couldn't be coming from inside the closet, could it? Another knock, slower, closer. My skin prickled. Whoever, whatever, was knocking wasn't outside my room. It was right there, just a few feet away, separated by a thin wooden door. And it was waiting for me to open it. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were trembling, but I forced myself to stand, every nerve in my body screaming at me to just leave the room. But I couldn't. Not without knowing. My eyes never left the closet door as I crossed the room, the knock still echoing in my ears. With each step, I could feel my heartbeat growing louder, my breath hitching. I reached out slowly, fingers brushing against the cold metal of the handle. One deep breath. Then I yanked the door open. Nothing. Just a row of clothes swaying slightly from the sudden motion. Relief washed over me for a moment, but it quickly turned to something worse. Something foul. A thick, nauseating stench hit me like a wall, making my stomach churn. It smelled like spoiled meat, rotten and putrid. The kind of smell that makes your body recoil before your mind even registers what it is. Covering my nose with my sleeve, I stepped closer, peering into the small, dark space. That's when I saw them. The scratch marks. They started at the back of the closet, clawed deep into the wooden floor, as if someone had dragged their fingers over and over again in the same spot. The grooves were deep, jagged, desperate. My throat tightened as I knelt down, tracing them with a shaking hand. They led to the far corner, right beneath a pile of old shoes. I hesitated, then pushed them aside, revealing a loose floorboard wedged awkwardly in place. Something about the way it was positioned. It looked like it had been pried open from below. I swallowed hard, a chill racing down my spine. Whoever made those marks, they were trying to get out. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. As soon as the sun rose, I went straight to campus security, stumbling over my words as I tried to explain what I'd found. They looked skeptical, but they sent maintenance over to check it out. I stayed, watching anxiously from the doorway as the workers pulled up the floorboards, each creak of the wood sending a fresh wave of dread through me. Then one of them froze, his face draining of color. He called over his supervisor, and I caught a glimpse of what they'd uncovered. Something small and shriveled, wedged tightly between the beams. A twisted, decayed hand, its fingers gnarled and claw-like. They told me later that it belonged to a girl who'd gone missing a decade ago. She used to live in my room. I couldn't stay after that. I packed up and left the dorm for good, but I heard the rumors, how the knocking didn't stop. The next girl who moved in heard it too, and others after her. And sometimes they say it's not just a knock. Some nights when the knocking turns frantic, they can hear faint, desperate scratching, like someone clawing at the floor, still trying to break free.